Although it was a mostly wholesome show about the positive effect imaginary friends can have on children, Foster's Home had a lot of underlying themes that fans who are now adults have started to recognize, and they paint a much deeper picture of mental illness than a lot of viewers initially realized. In fact, it almost seems like Foster's Home was a place that was specifically created to help the less fortunate children in the world live with and overcome whatever ailments might have been weighing on them. And although that may be a positive thing, it's hard to deny the darker tones that come to mind when thinking about all of the characters and the real reason why they were created. At the end of the day, Foster's Home for Imaginary Friends was essentially a pound where children can adopt a friend of their very own, which is a great thing, especially when you consider that almost every friend there is essentially a therapy or support animal. Now, that might sound like a downplay of the fact that these imaginary friends were conscious beings who could form their own thoughts, but that's not necessarily the case. Sure, when you get down to the nitty-gritty, they were pretty much emotional support pets, but that doesn't mean they didn't play an important role in the life of each child they came in contact with. As anyone who has actually needed an animal for support will tell you, they can be truly life-saving, whether it's because they're trained to take care of their owner whenever they're needed, or simply because they manage to bring light into your life. A supportive companion is one of the best things the world can give you. So the fact that there was an entire house/adoption agency in the Foster's universe that provided children with everything they needed to get through their daily lives is a truly positive message. That being said though, not everything that becomes positive is born from positive thinking. In fact, Foster's may have been the exact opposite. You see, Foster's Home for Imaginary Friends wouldn't exist in the first place if it wasn't for one very kind-hearted young girl who became the beloved matriarch of the house, Madame Foster. Sadly, even the kindest of people tend to have a darkness in them that can be overwhelming at times. As for Madame Foster, her dark cloud came in the form of a mental illness of sorts, most likely a mixture of depression and possibly even ADHD, judging by her hyperactive attitude as an old lady. Oh man, this is concerning for me because I have ADHD, and if this hyperactivity thing keeps going, that's gonna suck because I won't have the energy for it when I'm old. But I digress. So if you don't believe that simply because of how cheerful and giddy she seemed to be as an elderly woman, you should take a closer look at her character and all she's created in her life. Not much is known explicitly about Madame Foster's childhood, but you can tell a lot about it based on the imaginary friend that she created. Mr. Harriman was shown to be an almost stark contrast to Madame Foster's carefree and consistently calm demeanor, and that was probably to compensate for her mental state. As a child, she was most likely ridiculed by those around her for how hyperactive she was, which would have likely led to chaos following Madame Foster. So, in order to bring a bit of order into her life, she created Mr. Harriman, a stickler for the rules. Madame Foster created Mr. Harriman to not only keep her company, but to also bring a bit of order into her life. And just as an emotional support animal did, Mr. Harriman managed to bring the child a sense of happiness and calmness in the storm that was brewing in her head. In other words, Madame Foster needed a caretaker for her own hyperactive imagination and ended up with Mr. Harriman, who proved to be nothing but helpful. He was exactly what she needed to get through her childhood and realized that she probably wasn't the only kid who could benefit from a supportive friend. That was likely when she came up with the idea to create a house that could be used to home and rehome imaginary friends to help out all of the kids in her neighborhood and eventually the state. Granted, it's unclear exactly how popular Foster's Home for Imaginary Friends was in their universe, but based on certain episodes like Adopcalypse Now, they were well known. In that episode, the house ran a promotion called Adopt a Thought Saturday that saw a ton of families visiting the house to pick up an imaginary friend of their own, meaning that it must have been somewhat popular. You have no idea how many times I had to reread Adopcalypse. Exactly my point. Anyways, in other words, Madame Foster managed to make a successful business out of helping children get through their problems by giving them access to emotional support friends. Now, the importance behind a place like Foster's Home for Imaginary Friends, which I'm tired of saying, is something that shouldn't be overlooked, especially in a world where not every kid can create their own imaginary friend. From here on out, we're gonna say FIF because acronyms help me make life easier. You get it? Foster's Home for... We're gonna ignore the 4. So Foster's Home for Imaginary Friends, FIF. Alright, we're on the same page. But interestingly enough, the reason that a lot of young people in the show weren't able to come up with imaginary friends of their own may have been because of the very same mental illnesses they were trying to compete with in the first place. That's why a lot of the friends who were placed in fosters seem to come from a happy home. They were created by kids who were suffering from things like depression or anxiety, but who realized that they could cope with their own imagination. A perfect example of this is the young girl Goo. Goo made her first appearance in the episode Go Goo Go and was shown to have a very hyperactive imagination. She was a high-spirited young girl who couldn't seem to stop creating imaginary friends for herself and really for those around her as well. Goo was most likely suffering from some sort of attention deficit disorder as well as other possible mental ailments, but because of her strong will and her constant positive attitude, she was still able to use her imagination to cope. This is a sort of luxury that not every child could have, especially those who are mentally crippled by the oppressive thoughts that tend to come with mental illnesses. And make no mistake, they can be crippling. Not everyone who has anxiety, depression, or even something more serious handles it the same, and some are certainly affected more than others, which would hinder their ability to create something as pleasant as an imaginary friend. This is why a place like Foster's Home was so important. It was a place for those who no longer needed their imaginary friends to pass them on to those who did need them and needed that support but couldn't create one of their own. When it comes down to the professionalism of imaginary friends, they all clearly have their own strengths and weaknesses based on the illness that they were made for or to support. To break it down, there are basically two types of imaginary friends: the professional support friends and a group that shall be dubbed the amateurs for lack of a better word. The professional support friends include members of the house that have been there for a while and are basically used to train the other imaginary friends to be more supportive. This includes characters like Wilt, the anxiety-riddled basketball-playing imaginary friend. He was clearly created by a kid who not only loved to hoop, but also had problems with being shy and standing up for themselves. This is reflected by Wilt's passive behavior throughout the series, but despite that, he still managed to impart countless lessons to the younger imaginary friends like Blue and other new members of the house. The same can be said for Coco and Eduardo as well, both of which were clearly created to help support kids who had problems of their own. Coco is used to teach the other imaginary friends that despite how hyperactive you seem or how little those around you can understand you, you can still be successful. Coco was always on her grind and showed on numerous occasions that she could outsmart the majority of the people in Foster's Home. Now, the most professional of the imaginary friends was none other than Mr. Harriman, which was why he was placed in charge of the house. Madam Foster knew that he was responsible enough to teach the other friends how to act properly and how to handle or care for their children who would inevitably adopt them. Now, as for the amateurs, they're still imaginary friends who were most likely created to help their kid fight some sort of mental illness. They're just not as in tune with the support aspect of their job. This section included the more antagonistic and selfish imaginary friends like Duchess. She didn't seem to show any supportive qualities whenever she was on screen, which is probably why she never stayed adopted for too long and always ended up back at the house. Duchess was depicted as a very high-maintenance and self-centered imaginary friend who didn't really care to listen to anyone else in the house. Another example of an amateur imaginary friend would have to be Barry. She was just the embodiment of pure evil despite her adorable appearance. Barry didn't really make any attempt to help anyone in the show other than herself. The only thing she could be bothered with was trying to get Blue to love her. This actually brings up another amateur imaginary friend who wasn't the best at being an emotional support companion, and that's Beauregard Q Kazoo, or just Blue. Blue, despite being one of the main characters of the show, was depicted as very immature, and therefore he would have had a lot to learn before he could properly support anyone who would need it. In other words, not every imaginary friend, whether they had good intentions or not, could make for a good support companion, but that didn't mean there wasn't a place for them. Madam Foster likely understood that there were varying levels of mental illnesses and that not every imaginary friend needed to be able to handle the direst of situations. That's why she always kept her doors open for an imaginary friend that was waiting to be rehomed. But what do you think about the idea that Foster's Home was less of a place for imaginary friends and more of an adoption agency for emotional support pets, and just how much do you think that plays into their true roles within the series? Be sure to let me know in the comments below as always.